Are we done? No one can see your screen.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay, we had a little bit of a glitch here, so I'm just going to go back to the beginning of the presentation. I think maybe some of you were not able to hear me.
See your screen.
What's that?
See the screen is the problem there.
Yeah, they couldn't see the screen. So I just moved to this second slide, and you could hear me, apparently. So I'm just going to continue on. What we're trying to move from is the pasture that's at 943 pounds per acre. And I do see pastures around like that. And often at this time of the year, that's the kind of pastures I'm seeing cattle go out onto right now. And that pasture, you can see, has no residue left from the previous year. And so it's actually in a very weakened state. And it might be what you call your sacrifice pasture, so that's fine. But that pasture cannot be productive unless we change some of our management strategies. And a number of years ago, we did a project where we looked at a pasture that was producing around 900 pounds per acre, and we fenced it off. And just by letting the cattle into that area and then taking them back out, so putting it into a rotational grazing system, we more than doubled our production. So that was no fertility, it was nothing, it was just, you know, the correct stocking rate and going to a rotational grazing system. And then the picture on the right-hand side where we've got over 4,000 pounds of production was the same thing. It was a rotational grazing system plus the addition of 50 pounds of nitrogen. Nitrogen costs are high, so we're going to look at what including a legume in the pasture can do. But we more than quadrupled our production by just changing our management a little bit. And that gives you some ability to stockpile some of that forage. It takes some of the risk out of your grazing system. And plants that are tall like these ones here mean that they also have a deeper root system. So it's building in some ability to plan your pastures a little bit better. So it's not that hard to move from the 943 to the 4,000 pounds because we really didn't do that much. On that project, we also did an application of 100 pounds of nitrogen, and it was totally not economical. We only boosted the production by another, say, 500 pounds. So you didn't get the bang for the buck on the additional 100 or 50 pounds. And that's possible that what happens is moisture becomes the limiting factor and the grasses simply can't use that extra fertility. No. Okay, how do I move forward on this? They seem to be locked. We are having our difficulties today. It's not showing up, see? Oh, there we go. Okay. The other thing about planning your pastures a little bit more is what we're trying to do is keep pastures into productive species. And this pasture here shows a pasture that's becoming infected with a weed. And I often get calls from producers saying, you know, what can I do with this bad weed? And this is pasture sage. It's a native weed, but it's what you call a disturbance increaser weed. And with the disturbance of grazing and the animals grazing out the favorable plants, they weaken those plants and leave more opportunity for the weedy species to come in. So by planning a little bit better and putting in a better stocking rate for the system, what you will do is start limiting the amount of weeds that can sort of take over the stand. And so one of the things we're also looking for is to put in a system that provides the grasses that you need the ability to regrow and be vigorous so that they can outcompete these other weeds. If you notice in this pasture, there's a fence line in the front, and all of a sudden that weed disappears. And so that indicates to you that the grazing and the trampling from the livestock are, in fact, increasing the spread of that weed. So now you could go to someone and say, what can I spray on that? And a herbicide company would be very happy to sell you a herbicide that would take that weed out. But if you do that without changing your management, there's millions of seeds in the soil, and you'll be back in the same position in a very short period of time. So it's really just throwing good money after bad if you don't change your management. So one of the things that there's always a really big debate about is what grazing system is the best. And sometimes it's touted that the grazing system is going to save you. And I don't really think there is one best grazing system. The grazing system needs to be based on your land, your type of soil, what kind of forages you have, your objectives, your manpower. All those things need to come into play as to what kind of grazing system you're going to use. So I really think that it's better to learn something about the basic principles of animal needs, and then their behavior and plant ecology and plant behavior. And really it's that knowledge and experience that becomes your silver bullet. So if somebody tells you, I can put this on your field and it will solve all your problems, or I can put you into this grazing system and I can solve all your problems, it probably isn't going to happen if you don't understand some of these basic principles. One of the other things we're looking for is livestock gains on pasture. And this was a study done in the States. It was an 8-year study, and they looked at what happens with continuous versus rotational in terms of individual animal weight gain. And statistically, it looks like the continuous system allows the animals to gain more weight. But statistically it was not significant. So it's kind of there, and it makes sense because if you're on a continuous basis, you allow the animals to go select the forages they want, and they will select the best forages. But if you look at this other one over here, when they looked at herd weight gain, they found that under the rotational system, total herd weight gain was more than on the continuous system. And in this study, by using a rotational system, they gained 35% more production or more beef, and that came down to 18 pounds of beef per acre more. So the continuous system did not fare as well as the rotational. And some of the reasons the rotational may have done so well is because, for one, it sort of forces, like you're confining animals to a smaller space, so you don't give them the ability to select as much, so they have to eat what's kind of presented. So that means that maybe individual weight gain is not as good, but you are using more of the land, and you are what I call conditioning more of the plants. So if you clip them earlier in the season and you come back and graze later in the season, they now are not mature plants, they are vegetative plants. And vegetative plants are always higher in nutrition than mature plants. So just by confining the livestock into smaller spaces, you sort of change the animal's behavior. So they gained in a number of different ways. So for producers who are looking to just do individual animal weight, it's probably not the best way to look at it. You really want to know whether or not you can put your system into a rotational and actually carry more heads of cattle, because that's what they did. They carried more head of cattle by about 35%, and it ended up being 18 pounds of extra gain per acre. So that's one thing you could look at for a system that you're looking at. That study, one of the things that happens is often rotational grazing systems are set against continuous system, and a continuous rotational grazing system gets a bad rap because often in a continuous system, the system is also overstocked. And on that previous study, they actually had exactly the same stocking rate, and how they determined that was by how much litter was left at the end of their grazing in that system. So this is the litter. It's the stuff that's left behind from the year before. So what they did in both the rotational and the continuous system was they made sure there was exactly the same amount of litter left behind, which means they didn't allow the cattle on the continuous system to keep grazing and grazing until there was no forage left. And litter is really important in the production of a stand because it helps you retain the moisture that falls. It does actually help enhance water infiltration. Part of that is it slows the raindrops down as they hit the ground. that allows the water to follow the root channels into the soil. A raindrop hitting just onto bare soil actually it has enough impact that it breaks the soil apart, soil particles apart, and causes them to become very fragmented. And with that fragmentation, you close all the pores in the soil so that you can't allow the water to infiltrate. So also the litter is what carries the nutrients from the previous year, so with it on top of the soil, it eventually degrades and releases the nutrients, so you get that nutrient cycling. There was a study done in Alberta back in probably the 90s, and they looked at how much rain could fall on land, and if you had litter versus no litter, how much more water. And what they showed was that in an hour, 2.5 inches of precipitation could go onto this piece of land without the water running off, where if it was overgrazed and there was no litter, they only saved 1/2 inch of the rain. So you cannot change how much precipitation falls on your land, but you can change on how much actually sticks around, right? So if you have litter there, they managed to keep 2.5 inches per hour could fall on that land and it could infiltrate the soil. And where it was overgrazed, they could only keep 1/2 inch of precipitation. So you actually make your site droughtier than it already is, which is really important in our part of the country because oops, now what have I done? I'm having fun with this. I wish we had a mouse, Lionel. Now I've really done it. Can you see them? You can? Oh, you can kind of see them. Okay, I'm looking at a different direction and I can't see it. Sorry about that. So remember I was talking about the role that fertility did. And of course, most pastures, people are very reluctant to put on nitrogen fertilizer. But this was some work done out of the Brandon Research Station when Paul McCaughey was still around. And it shows that the role that the legume has in it. And of course, what legumes do is they fix atmospheric nitrogen and put it into the soil. And on their pastures, they increased their yield by 65%. Now that sounds good, but of course that's not the whole story because you don't get to use 65% more forage. It increased their carrying capacity by 25%. So just by having this legume, so whether that's sisal milk vetch or alfalfa or red clover or whatever you put in, and it's fixing nitrogen, you can increase your carrying capacity by about 25%. They increased their average daily gain by about 10%, and they increased their gain per hectare by 22%. So that's pretty significant. So that's the difference between just having a grass pasture with no nitrogen and having a pasture where you've included a legume. So I always ask this question, and it's actually easier to ask this question when we have a crowd, because I like to ask the question about what is the purpose of a grazing system. And what people usually tell me is their purpose is to have more pounds of beef. They want to have, they want to maybe have the environment or the grasses do better and that sort of thing. And those are good answers. I think those are sort of like the ultimate outcome. But I like to think about it this way because I think it leads us better to ask the questions we need to ask if our grazing system is not giving us what we want. So to me, the purpose of a grazing system is to control when, where, and how long your livestock spend in any particular place. It's all about taking away the control from the cow and you having the control. Because there's a couple things. Cows, for one, have no environmental conscience. So they don't say, I've overgrazed that plant too many times, so I think I should move to a different area. And they also have no economic goals, right? She's just going to go out and do what's best for her. So you need to understand the animal's needs. So it's not just, though, as a livestock producer, you're not just dealing with your livestock. You also have to deal with your resource. And so you have to be the one to control when, where, and how long they spend so that you can meet the needs of the resource. because your animal is not going to do it. They will just, you know, in the fall, if they're not breaking out of the fence, you are not controlling how long that they're staying there or where they're staying. And so you might be damaging your forages. The cow doesn't care. That responsibility has to come back to you. So really, when you do take care of controlling when, where, and how long the animals graze in an area, and it's based on the forage resource or the soil resource or many things to do with the resources, the outcome is you'll have more resilient pastures, higher production, and then you get your final, what you're really after, which is the conversion of that production into pounds of beef. So I want to take you through the grazing principles. And a grazing principle is like a law. And these principles were kind of teased out probably back in the 1930s and 40s because of the science of range management. And when the United States or Canada, North America was first, had the Europeans come over, they came over from a very wetter climate. And they brought with them their livestock husbandry techniques from there, and then they also were demanded that we were on a quarter section, they raised so many livestock. And what wasn't understood was that in the drier climate of most of North America, that this system did not work. And so the ranges degraded very badly on the western parts of North America. And so there was the science of range management was born. And so they sort of teased out what things do you have to do in order to maintain healthy grasslands. And so they determined that these are the actual grazing principles. So if you go against any one of these 4 grazing principles, you are probably not going to be meeting the needs of the system or the ecological system. So the first one is to balance livestock demand with forage supply. So, I mean, that's just the same as you having to know how much hay to buy for the winter to get you through the months, right? Well, it's the same thing with the pasture. The pasture only produces so much, so you can only put so many cattle for so long. The second is to try to use the landscape evenly. And so a lot of people do not go to any trouble to try to distribute their livestock evenly. So you maybe have purchased 160 acres, but you may allow the cattle to really only use 80 acres of it. The third is to provide forage with adequate recovery period after grazing. And I'm going to talk about how long this really needs to be, and it really does vary a lot, and in our drier climates it's probably a lot longer than we actually think. And the last is to avoid grazing during vulnerable periods, and this is sort of the one where I'm going to talk about what's happening right now in the spring and why it is such a vulnerable period. So the first is to determine carrying capacity. So the first step that you really need to do is to determine how much production your pasture is actually giving you. And once you know how much pasture you have, then you need to actually balance it, because there's your animal demand, how much they need to eat, but there's also the plant demand. So the plant has needs as well, even though we often don't think about them very often. I often, on the right-hand side, you can see I put up something called the grazing cage, and it stays up for the season, and then I go out with a frame of known size, and I clip, and then I dry that sample, and then I weigh it and calculate it back to pounds per acre, or you can work it to kilograms per hectare, whatever you want to do. So when I start working with producers, I often say, well, what's your pasture production? How many pounds per acre do you think you get in a season? And they say, oh, I have no idea. So sometimes it's easier for them to think about, I say to them, well, if you were to take your baler out there, how many bales per acre do you think that you would get off that land? And sometimes they say, oh, that pasture is very poor. I'd get maybe a bale or a bale and a half, or I wouldn't even get a bale, or I'd get 2.5 bales. Well, if you kind of know that your bales are 1,400 pounds, that's starting to give you an idea that you do kind of have a bit of an idea of what your production will be. I like to, I'm just going to go back. I like to clip for a number of years because it takes into account the dry years and the wet years. And unless you're going to take and put additional animals in or out, or you're going to shorten your grazing season or lengthen your grazing season, it's nice. I like to, in many of the areas, just stock to what would sort of be an average production. And on the years where you get a lot more production, you might be able to graze a lot longer, or you might be able to stockpile some of that forage or leave it to help with the nutrient recycling and building a litter layer. On the years where you have a lot less production, your pastures may actually become a little bit overgrazed, but hopefully we don't have multiple years like that. I'm really not having a good time with this thing, Lionel. So I think of pasture in this way. Often I have someone ask me, well, my neighbor's grazing 600 yearlings on his quarter section. Can I do that? Well, there's a couple things that come into play. For one, we don't know if he's going to be able to do that year after year, because really just about anybody can send animals out to a pasture and they can graze it. But if they hit it so hard that they damage the pasture, then it may have been a one-year thing. So when you're trying to do a calculation for carrying capacity, there's some things you need to know. And I think of a pasture like this pie. There really is a finite amount of forage that is there. And it's been touted that if you put in a rotational grazing system, you can increase your stocking rate. Well, that's only kind of true. We saw that data earlier that said if you did, and you had it stocked properly, that you could probably eventually add more animals because you'd get more forage. But when you begin, you have a finite amount of forage. So it doesn't matter how many ways I cut this pie up, it'll still only feed so many people for so many days. So the question you need to ask yourself is, what length of time does this pie or this pasture need to feed, right? So is this pie just for one day, or is it for a whole month, right? So that changes things a lot. The other question that comes into play is how many. So was this pie just for me, or was it to feed 6 people, or was it to feed 100 people? So you can see if it was to feed 100 people, it doesn't matter how I slice it up, it really isn't enough to feed everybody. Also, what comes into play that as humans we don't usually really think about for our own food intake very much is the size of the animal, but this has a huge difference with livestock. So if you have some 1,700-pound cows, they eat considerably more than a 700-weight steer or grasser. So you also need to know, and that's why they brought in that term animal unit or animal unit month, is they were trying to make things equal so that you knew how much you're putting out. But you have to keep in mind, because this pie, if you sat, 6 men down at a table, the length of time might be one meal, and 6 people might get a nice sized piece of pie. But if you had 6 newborn babies, would that pie feed them for just one meal, or would it feed them for 3 meals, or would it feed them for maybe 4 or 5 days? So the size of the animal has a huge play on determining your carrying capacity. So this is a calculation sheet that I use, and you can see that it starts off with that first thing I wanted you to determine was, what do you think your forage production on your pasture is? And then we have to use what we call a safe use factor, and that's called the utilization rate. And so what it says is that if your pasture grows 1,000 pounds of forage, you can't use all 1,000 pounds. You have to leave something behind for nutrient cycling, for building up litter, for allowing the plant to make its own food, to photosynthesize. So if in our part of the country, if you were only leaving 200 pounds of forage behind, I can guarantee you're going to have a very poor stand of grass. It's going to become weedy. It's not going to be productive. We probably need on most soils to be leaving behind around 1,000 pounds. So if you had 5,000 pounds of production, you might be able to use a utilization rate of 80%. Oops, I've done it again, Lionel. So But if you were only producing 1,000 pounds of forage production, you can't use 1,000 pounds. So you might want to leave maybe 500 pounds behind on some of the sandier soils. Probably 500 to 800 pounds would be nice to leave behind. So you might only be using 20, 30, or 50% of that production. So I put that in at the beginning because we don't want to leave it to chance that you don't leave that forage behind. You multiply that by the number of acres, and that gives you the total amount of what I call available forage. So that's taking into account the environmental or the ecological needs of the soils, the plants, and everything else. So it already pre-calculates in what you need to leave behind. So then we take the weight of the cow, and when you take, it's pretty accurate as to how much a cow will eat. I use on average about 2.5% in there. But if a cow was on extremely good pasture, she may eat 3 or 3.5% of her body weight. And if she was on very poor pasture, that really short stuff, she may only be intaking 1.5%. 1.5% intake is basically starvation diet. They will continue to really go downhill with that amount. So 2.5 is kind of what I use. And then that kicks out what the forage requirement per cow per day is on that. And that's in dry matter, so everything's in dry matter. So then there's two ways to use this information. Somebody either comes up to me and says, well, I just, rented a pasture, how many head can I put out there? Because maybe the number of grazing days they want to graze for 122 days or 4 months. So we plunk in the forage required per cow, the number of days grazing, and that equals the forage required per cow per grazing period. And then we've already calculated up above for that pasture how much is available. So you just divide that by the pounds that the cow requires for the total number of days. And so it will kick out how many cows that pasture will carry. Now the other thing that happens is somebody says, oh, I have 125 head and this is my pasture. So you just do the same thing. We know how much each cow requires. We know how many head we have, so we know what the daily requirement is. We know how much forage they have or we have available. So we divide that by the pounds the herd needs per day, and it'll kick out the number of days that pasture will carry that. Now, where people run into problems is either drought occurs and you don't get what you thought your production was going to be, or we get more precipitation and we get more. So this is just a starting point. Then you have to be thinking about, is it worse or is it better than what I originally thought it was going to be? When you go to a grazing system, you're sort of changing animal behavior by changing stock density. And that's different than carrying capacity. Carrying capacity tells you how many animals the land can carry. But stock density just tells you how much are you presenting to each animal when they're on a field. So if you had 160 acres, you basically got a quarter of an animal unit per acre. But if you divide that paddock into 16 10-acre paddocks, now you've got 4 animal units per acre. So you're changing your behavior. It's kind of like us going to a smorgasbord. We go to the buffet and we go through the line the first time and we take all of our favorite stuff and we come back to the table, and when we get up, we go back and we only pick, on our second time, we only pick our most favorite things, right? So that's kind of like that top one there. They can go around and pick their most favorite stuff, and then they can pick their even more favorite stuff the next time around. But when you put them into a smaller paddock like below, it's kind of like our family at Christmas when we have 17 of us around the table. There's a finite amount of food. Everybody just goes for it, and you eat whatever you can get your hands on. So that's what happens with livestock too. It changes their behavior. All of a sudden, they eat more of the stuff that they would have probably selected against if they had had the ability to. This can backfire if you have a pasture with poisonous weeds in it or something like that. Then this is not a good ploy because the animals could possibly be forced to eat a poisonous weed. However, if you have weeds that are not poisonous, but are starting to take over the pasture, this can be a good thing, because if the animals don't eat the weed, they will at least knock it down. And so they take away its competitive advantage against the grasses or forages that you want to favor. So it sort of levels the playing field, you could say. So to distribute animals evenly, this really is about divvying out the grazing pressure equally on all plants and not just some. And so if we don't distribute them evenly, some plants will get grazed a lot and some plants will not. So this is kind of sort of ideal. You've got your animals all over the field and they're using it quite evenly. This is less ideal. Pasture shape and or layout and where you place your salt and water can influence where and how the animals use the pasture. So distribution can be affected by the shape. So when you have these pie-shaped fields, which are very convenient, often if you have water in sort of the center of an area, you will get more grazing near that point, and you'll get a lot of trailing. And I've been out in some of these systems, and I've counted, 15 to 17 trails getting squeezed down to the water, and it's because of the squeezing effect. So wherever you have a trail, you're not got grass growing, basically. So you want to be able to distribute them out. So when you're developing pastures, you should be thinking about the shape. It is often determined by where your water is or by your topography or where the bush is. So I understand it's not always perfect. But there was some work done by Jim Garish down in the States, and he found that animals go from water to grazing and then to salt, and then they lay down and chew their cud. And so if you put the salt and water beside each other, and if you put salt water and shade beside each other, it's even worse. So they take their water and they only walk out so far, and then they need their salt, and they come back to the salt, and then if you have your shade there as well, they'll lay down in the shade and they'll ruminate, right? So you need to do something that's very simple to get these cattle to move out and about. And one of the simplest things you can do with very little cost is to take your salt away from the water and put it in another location of the field. Now, I know that there's logistical reasons why guys put the salt beside the water. It's because they need to come check cattle health. They can kind of determine, usually you know about when your cattle are going to be hanging around the water and the salt. So that's an easy way for you to drive up, check the water, put a new salt block out, and check their herd health. So there are reasons why people do it, but it doesn't really help with distributing your animals and getting them to use the whole field. June produces almost all of the forage that we need, and if you do not sort of get your cattle out to the farther ends of the field, they will just continue to graze in June the area close to those things and not venture out. Once you've done that, now you've made ripe plants at the far ends of the field, which they don't like as much, and you've got sort of the succulent regrazed grass near the water. And so then it's harder to get them to distribute. So there's a few things about salt. If you have bare ground around your salt ground, you have one of a couple things going on. You either do not have enough salt grounds for the number of head. You want about 1 salt block per 25 head. Or you are leaving your salt block in one location too long. So I am always trying to encourage people to take their salt block and move it around. And move it around to the areas where the livestock don't get to as much. So if you have a far end where the forage always gets ripe before the cattle ever get over there, I would take the time to start moving the salt block over to that area with good production but low utilization. Sometimes you can use the salt block by taking out aspen suckers or buckbrush suckers or round juniper. So those are the places where I'd place salt. So I'd kind of make the cows work and do work for me at the same time as providing them with the salt. Having to give them the salt is a given, but how we use the salt and how we make the cows work for us while they're taking their salt is what I'm kind of looking for. So the third of the grazing principles is to avoid or minimize grazing impact during vulnerable periods. And this is really the time I was really wanting to to talk to you about today is this whole spring period. Now the second period is when we have wet soils. So that can be often in the spring or anytime when you have really heavy rainfalls. And all of you will kind of know where your land is low, but this kind of pugging and hummocking that you can see in this picture is very detrimental to forage production. It compacts the soil, so it pushes all the air spaces out of the soil so it can no longer hold water there or air. It also, just the shape of the hoof of the animal will what you call shear the plant off. So you'll have a crown and the animal will step and the soil is soft enough that you actually shear that plant in half or part of it off. And so that automatically eventually will kill that plant, or it will certainly reduce its yield. So the other really critical period is this spring period. And I first want to take you through why spring is so critical. And here we have a grass plant with a leaf, and most of us just think about the grass plant leaf as, oh good, there's something out there for my cattle to graze. But we need to think about what that leaf is to the plant, because you are dealing with an ecological system here. We need to take care of both sides of the equation, not only the animal but also the plant. And so we have to go back to our high school chemistry, and we have to look at this equation. And this equation is the equation of photosynthesis. So basically the plant is taking carbon dioxide out of the air, water out of the soil. We are taking the energy from the sun, and in this leaf, in the chlorophyll, the process of photosynthesis is taking place. And what it spits out on the other side, the important, really important part, is this one right here in red. These units with carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen are basically energy. They're the carbohydrates, sugars, fructoses, sucroses, starches, all those sort of things. And this is the first step for the plant. If the plant does not have leaf area to make this chemical equation occur, this plant is not making food for itself. And if it can't make food for itself, it cannot go on with any other life processes. So it also kicks out oxygen and water. But the important part for us is this first part of the chemical reaction where it has made itself food. And from making this very, very simple carbohydrate, it then builds everything else. It builds more complex carbohydrates. It builds growth in the form of structural carbohydrates, proteins, enzymes, vitamins. Everything else takes place after. So food to a plant is not water in the soil. It is not nitrogen in the soil. It is not potassium in the soil. It is not any of those things. You can see in this equation that there are no P, K, S, nitrogen, or anything else. So if you do not allow this leaf to start this process, then that's why we can really reduce production so much. So now knowing that, this table or this graph here shows the carbohydrate level in a grass plant root. And so you can see in the fall it's at a high level, and if there's fall regrowth it might draw down, but if there is no fall regrowth it goes into the winter with quite a high level of carbohydrates in the root. So you come over here into January and you can see it slowly dropping down, slowly dropping down, slowly dropping down. And then all of a sudden we get here into May, early May or late April, and all of a sudden it really drops down. So that really big drop down is this plant sending up its first leaves. In other words, it's not putting any carbohydrates into the roots. Let's back up a minute, because once the plant has made those carbohydrates with photosynthesis, it stores them in the roots. And that's what's so important about perennial plants, is that it has a huge root system which it stores carbohydrates in for later use. And that later use might be after winter or after a drought or sometime like that. If it's not able to photosynthesize, it has to draw on these carbohydrates in the roots. And so this is a grass plant I just picked today, May 15th, and you can see it's at about 2 and maybe 3/4 of a leaf or 2 1/2 of a leaf. And you need about a 3 1/2 to 4 leaf stage for that plant to start putting carbohydrates back in the root. So what's happening right now is we have cows out on pasture at this point right here. And this plant, even though it has a few leaves up, they are not storing food back in the roots yet. They are still drawing on last year's root reserves, right? So now we come in the spring and we nip this plant off. I cut this one down to 1 inch, so you can see tiny little bit of photosynthetic capacity. And basically we took away the warehouse or the factory to make food. And so if the plant has to then go back into its root system to draw on carbohydrates to put up new leaves, it draws it down. And if your cows are still out there and they clip out what it puts up again, it draws down again. So it draws down again. And if you keep doing this, you can actually have death of individual plants and or extremely slow regrowth. And we've all seen that. The pastures that had good high growth the year before put up bigger and higher growth in the spring. The ones that were really in a poor state earlier have a really difficult time recovering. This grazing at this stage right now can probably hurt your production by about 45% just by taking that early season growth. And so I don't know very many producers that can afford to lose 45% of that field's production in any given year. So really we need to go out to pasture. I know just about everybody is short on feed. So what can we do if we have to go to pasture early? What can we do to minimize the impact of this early spring grazing? Now, I've included some things that will take, planning in the future, because we could use pasture that was stockpiled the year before. This has the benefit that those plants will have been storing carbohydrates in their roots because they won't have been grazed in the fall. So they will have a really big storehouse of carbohydrates. So it's kind of like they've got lots of rocket fuel to put up those few grass leaves. And if you graze them off, they have a bigger root system to put up more. So they're just a bigger, more robust system. You could do something called skim grazing. And this is where you take and you allow the cow to nip off about like that. And I did that here. And what you can see is that we haven't halted this plant. We haven't taken its growing point. Did it again. I wished I had a mouse. Skim grazing is a technique in which you move the cattle very quickly. So you might have a number of fields around your place and you just go fast. And it might have to be really fast. It may be a number of hours or it may be a number of days. It really depends on how many cattle you have and how big your pastures are. So what this does is it doesn't hit the plant as hard. And so you just move really, really fast and still give your animals something to eat. Another strategy might be is that you just have a sacrificed pasture and you continue to put supplemental feed out there. This works too. You could also use a sacrificed pasture as a different pasture every year. So in other words, the sacrificed pasture might be the pasture that wasn't grazed in the fall the year before. So it might be the stockpiled pasture from the year before. By moving around your sacrificed pasture, you're not hitting that pasture during that really vulnerable period in the spring. So you're allowing that pasture the previous year to build a big root system, and so you're just taking what's hard on the plants and you're sort of divvying it out amongst more plants or more fields. You can also do things like seed fall rye in the fall, and you will have early spring pasture. You could plant grasses that are very early, and probably one of the earliest is crested wheatgrass. But crested wheatgrass in Manitoba is only good probably for our driest and lightest soils. Anybody who's in a little bit higher moisture area with a little bit heavier soil, so even a good loam or clay loam soil, crested wheatgrass will not survive. It gets root rot and crown rot because it's just too much moisture for it. But it is a grass that does have the ability to take a very hard grazing in the spring, and it has the ability to recover very quickly. It's just the physiology of that plant is that's the way it is. And so it's, if you have the ability to put it in, I would probably put in a number of acres, and you could use it every spring. Some people say to me, well, meadow brome I have found is as early as crested wheatgrass. But the problem with meadow brome is it is one of those grasses that stores some of its carbohydrates in its stem bases. So you want to be only grazing meadow brome down to about 4 inches, not any lower. Otherwise, you're taking away carbohydrates, which it needs for regrowing. So that's one of the problems. The physiology of the plant is different than crested wheatgrass. Crested wheatgrass can be grazed right down to, like, say, 1 inch, and it will bounce back. So those are some strategies. There's probably more out there. I know everybody's really desperate for feed, but understand that if you do graze during this really vulnerable period, there is going to be a consequence. So it's whether or not you can live with that consequence or whether or not you can do something about it. Now, the last of the grazing principles is to allow effective recovery of forages after grazing. And even though the grass plant and the herbivore co-evolved and are very adapted to each other, there is no doubt that every time your animal grazes a forage plant, it does cost that plant. It's a cost to the plant. The plant has to go back to work to try to rebuild itself. And effective rest is only rest that takes place when the plant can actively grow. So there has to be moisture, and it has to be able to actively grow. So rest is not the winter months. It is not taking the cows off just as drought occurs and the plant gets no chance to regrow and it just sits there dormant for the whole summer and then you come back later. That is not effective rest. Effective rest has to be that this root system can regrow. So some people like to graze right off like a haying, but it does delay out how many days it takes for that plant to fully recover. If you take off less, like my skim grazing example, not as much of the root system dies. What we only ever see is what's above ground, but we're not considering what's happening below ground. And when your plant has been grazed at the top, it always has to drop some of its roots below. So this plant was grazed harder, it had to drop more of its roots because there's nothing up here to support the life of these roots. So it uses up the carbohydrates in these roots to keep the crown alive, and as it does that, they die. If you don't hit it as hard, it doesn't have to drop as many of those roots. So this is sort of also a drought protection. The deeper your rooting as you go into the hotter and drier part of the summer is better, and your plant recovers much more quickly. And I wouldn't look at the number of days here because this is probably a study done in a really good area, you know, like maybe the southern states or mid states or something like that, or maybe even Carmen, you know, where they have better soils and better moisture. So, but for any of us who live in the drier areas or on poorer soils, this rest period could be maybe 30 or 60 days. So, allowing effective recovery. So this plant now, you know, if you grazed it and it's going into winter, it has a big full root system back again. This one, you grazed it hard and now it's gone into winter without a very big storehouse. So that plant just naturally the next spring will not be as strong and vigorous as the plant below it. So pasture systems, how many pastures do you need? Well, that's a good question. The people who are sort of against continuous grazing, saying that all the plants get grazed 100% of the time and 0 of them get rest, that's only kind of true. Generally speaking, what happens if it's stocked properly is some of the plants get grazed all the time and some of the plants get grazed not at all. So the animals do this selection thing. If you're severely overstocked on a continuous system, then yes, every single plant gets grazed probably every day or every week and never gets any rest. All we have to do is drop one fence in, and now we're controlling the animal, right? Because remember I said that the whole point of the grazing system is to have control. So you want to control this animal. Now you're demanding that she gives 50% rest time to the plants that she may favor. you put in 4 paddocks, and now you're guaranteeing the plant 75% rest. And of course you can go and divide and divide and divide, but now you can see that they're getting 95% of the time is in rest and only 6% of the time they're being grazed. So to recap, really determine if your stocking rate is set to meet both the livestock and forage needs. You do that by determining your carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is a number that tells you whether or not you have forage supply to meet animal demand and also leaving enough for the ecological processes to take place. Your stocking rate can be above or below that, but that just depends on how many you put out there. Do you avoid or minimize grazing during vulnerable times? So if you can't afford to lose 45% of your year's production, then it's possible that if you had hay left still, you would continue to feed until those pastures were actually ready. And that means that the soils are not really soft so they can be damaged. And it also means that that plant is probably at least 3.5 to 4 leaf stage before grazing begins. Does your grazing system do an adequate job of distributing the livestock evenly? Well, there are places within a pasture that you should not think that you have to get your animals to use every inch. The forage within dense trees is probably not usable. A lot of pastures will have sort of swampland or lowland, which is a combination of sedges and rushes and maybe cattails and stuff like that. That's not really food, so you have to sort of take those acres out of your calculation for how much area your animals can eat. So don't just look across and say, oh, it's all green, they should be able to use all of it and I should be able to get my cattle to go into those areas. Some areas are not really that grazable, so you have to think about what are your grazable areas and are you getting your livestock to them. And finally, after grazing, do you allow your forages to fully recover? And so what does fully recover mean? Well, I guess that's one question that is a little bit, mostly we don't really kind of think about what fully recovered means. And in my experience, the things that I've learned over the last 20 years working in this industry is really when I first came out and started working in it, I used to think that 30 to 40 days would probably do it. And in most of the environments that I work in, at least, I think it's probably more like 60 to 90 days. And the producers that I have seen that have adopted rotational grazing and have adopted long rest periods seem to be, I think, have the most successful systems. In fact, their systems are becoming so successful that they could just keep adding animals, but the herds, they don't even want that big of a herd. So that's how much more grass they're growing than what they were when they were sort of doing it as is. So that is the end of my presentation. Are there any questions?
Just hold on one second.
It's really awful. See, I can see it here too.
Okay, we're having just a bit of a problem today. Maybe what I should do is maybe explain. I should have done it at the beginning. We had some problems with the computer system here in Cirrus. We couldn't get on the internet, so we're doing this on a standalone computer. So sometimes it takes a little bit extra work to figure things out. And so I guess with that, we'll be checking later if there was questions. And it has been recorded, so we are good to go that way. So we'll be definitely putting it on for your viewing later. And I guess with that, we will end the webinar for today. Thanks, Jean.
Okay, thank you.